thank you to those of you that did come to this presentation today. So I'm Teresa Wilhelmsen. I'm the Utah State Engineer and Director of the Division of Water Rights. And what we have for you today is a summary of the existing water right appropriation policy for this area and some additional water right information that we are looking at as we try to plan what policy may be appropriate for the area moving forward. And also we'll talk about the governor's proclamation that was recently issued, and then a report that I will need to do in November. And so these public meetings are part of gathering that information to help us understand what to present to the governor and the legislature on how effective the proclamation was. So with me here today, we do have some staff that are here, but Blake Bingham is one of my deputy state engineers, and he is going to present the data that we have for you today. So I'm just going to be real quick here. Thank you for coming. Welcome you, and I'm going to turn the time over to Blake. So.
Thanks, Teresa. Just one housekeeping item. There should be a sign-up list going around. If you get a chance, sign that. We just use that to reach out and make contact for further notice of additional meetings. That's really the purpose of that. So make sure if you haven't signed that it's there at the back. Eric Jones, Assistant State Engineer for the Appropriation Section, is kind of managing that. So my name is Blake Bingham. I'm the Deputy State Engineer. I supervise all the regions that are tributary to the Great Salt Lake. One of those regions is what we call the Weber River and West Desert Office, which Bountiful is part of. Bountiful Sub-area is part of. Gary Brimley, who's the regional engineer, couldn't make it tonight, so he's asked me, or I volunteered to take his presentation for him and just kind of walk you through some of the policies that Teresa's already kind of introduced. So with that, let's get started. Here's our agenda. We'll talk about the current policy. We'll go over some of the water data that's available, look at some of the trends. We'll touch on the governor's proclamation that he issued last November with regard to appropriation of new water rights. We'll talk about a proposed policy change and then some next steps. And as Teresa mentioned, I think the main thrust of tonight's meeting is to have a discussion, put some information out, receive some feedback, and open those channels of communication to allow for additional feedback, especially as we gather those comments and try to understand what the best policy for this area is before we report back to the governor in November. Questions and comments. We can kind of keep it pretty informal. If you have a question during the presentation, let's go ahead and ask that. I do ask that you come up to the mic just because, or grab the mic, just for recording purposes. And if anyone decides to attend online, that's going to be their best bet of hearing it. So let's go ahead and jump in. Okay. So the current policy for kind of what we're calling the Bountiful Sub-area. So, and just so to put some left and right limits on what we consider the sub-area, Bountiful Sub-area, is essentially Bountiful down to the boundary between Davis County and Salt Lake County. On the north side, it's the boundary of Centerville and Farmington. So that's its northern limits. Eastern limits, Wasatch Front. Western limits can be Farmington Bay and the Jordan River. So currently, the state engineer considers this area to be fully appropriated as it relates to surface waters. So any new diversions or consumptive uses must be accomplished by acquiring a water right and doing a change application to move it to that location we want to do it in. There is a groundwater management plan. We'll cover that a little bit here shortly, but in essence, new groundwater appropriations. And so when I say appropriations, I mean that's a new application. They're limited to situations where a public water supplier can't provide service. And then there's a further limitation that it'll be limited for domestic and stock watering purposes for up to 1 acre-foot per application. And it's subject to the potential for a public water system to connect to that residents in the future. So generally how we accomplish that is through fixed time applications. Getting a little bit in the weeds, but the whole premise is, hey, we want to allow people to build their houses and to and in order to do that, they need a well. However, once a public water system is able to provide them water, we want them to abandon that well and take the water from the public water system. Change applications, again, a change application is when you have a water right and you want to do something different with that water right, whether that be changing the nature of the beneficial use, where you're going to divert it from, those types of, or the place of use, those types of things. Those are reviewed individually and acted on their own individual merits. We want to make sure as we review that we're being careful that they don't impair existing rights. So if we're going to move a water right from one area to another, wherever you're moving it into, we want to be careful and kind of look at that area to make sure that there won't be an impact to existing right holders. Okay, there is a existing groundwater management plan. The plan has many facets to it, but it's relatively abbreviated. It's about 2 pages long. I have a copy up here if you want to come see it afterwards. But kind of the highlights of it are, they estimated in a USGS technical publication that was done back in 1991 that within the Bountiful Sub-area, there was about 26,000 acre-feet of recharge. And so looking at the recharge and the discharge from the aquifer, state engineer concluded that, you know, a annual discharge rate of about 25,000 acre-feet from the groundwater on a 5-year average, a rolling average, would be appropriate, and that it couldn't exceed 30,000 acre-feet in any one single calendar year. So that was just kind of put some left and right limits on the groundwater appropriation, recognizing that it's the aquifers is limited to about 26,000 acre-feet of annual recharge. And there's different components of that recharge, whether it's infiltration from irrigation, the streams, the precipitation, and there's different components of that. And as I'm sure you are aware, Bountiful is kind of urbanized over the decades, and probably there's less return flow as a result of large-scale irrigation. So these are just estimates that were done by the USGS in 1991, and so this is a kind of the best data we have. But I'm going to go over some of the what we see as far as groundwater trends and as well as pumping withdrawals. Part of the groundwater management plan requires that wells must be spaced such that they don't incur a maximum of 15 feet of drawdown on water or on a well with a senior water right. Applications appropriate will be considered only for domestic and stock watering filings. Again, this is for groundwater only, limited to an acre-foot where public supply is unavailable. And again, change applications will be critically reviewed, as they always are. We always want to protect existing rights whenever change applications are filed to make sure that there isn't going to be impacting people who were there first. So let's look at some of the groundwater usage. So we have kind of 2 different time frames here. And you're welcome to take photos of these slides. These slides will be available on our website. You can for download later if you don't want to use your camera to take snapshots. So the first data just there on the top, kind of that top row, comes from the USGS and their annual groundwater conditions report. And so you can see that it goes all the way back to about 1962 up to about 2018. And they estimated about 52,000 acre-feet of annual withdrawal. But I just want to caveat that. So remember, we said that the annual recharge was about 26,000 acre-feet. Well, this 52,000 acre-feet is actually includes areas like the Weber Delta and Perry. So you have to kind of carve out the Bountiful Sub-area to kind of figure out what that is. Well, in 2018, they started doing that. And so that bottom row represents the current estimates. And how they do this, they monitor select wells, and then they kind of make estimates based on the monitoring of those wells. And so USGS estimates that around 12,357 acre-feet on average is the groundwater discharge in the Bountiful area currently. Again, remember that we said, well, there's probably about 26,000 acre-feet of recharge, and current estimates show the discharge about 12,000 acre-feet. So you might think, well, there should be plenty, right? There shouldn't have an impact. Well, unfortunately, we're looking at the groundwater trends, and as you can kind of note yourself, These are select wells within Centerville, Bountiful area. There's a noticeable downward trend. And so this is something that we want to understand better, and we want to ensure that the groundwater is not being mined, that we're not exceeding the safe yield of the aquifer. So as you can kind of see, the top well there, that's a well, I believe, that's just in Centerville, 4th South, 6th West. The next well is, I think, right behind Viewmont High School there at 1250 North, 150 West. And then a couple wells around the 800 North mark, 800 West and 1100 West. But as you look at them, you can all kind of see a downward trend. So that third well, along, if you're going top to bottom, the one at 750 North, 800 West, you'll note that it actually starts out at in a negative condition and goes to a positive. That just means that it was once free flowing and no longer is free flowing. And so we continue to see these groundwater conditions deteriorate within the Bountiful Sub-area, and it's cause for some concern. And I think as we look at the data, where we get it from, and this is kind of an overview of where we get this data from. We have 6 reporting public water suppliers. We have those 4 oil refineries, one of which is inactive. About 31,000 or 32,000 total connections. And so when we look at the water use, the annual water use, we come up with about 15,400 acre feet of water use that's being reported to us. Now, those are only select entities. That doesn't include all of the individual wells everywhere, but this is the actual water use data being reported to us. And we've already kind of talked that 12,000 acre foot number that's based on a estimation from the USGS. So what do those water rights look like? So here's kind of the summary of existing appropriations in the Bountiful Sub-area. So across the top, the columns, I have a groundwater top column, a surface water, and then just a total on the right. And then you see the rows are separated by unapproved applications, approved applications, and then perfected rights. For those of you who are maybe a little bit unfamiliar with how water rights are appropriated, you get an application, you submit an application, and it's an unapproved application. Then the state engineer approves it, then it's approved, and you're required to submit proof. Once you submit proof, it's called, it perfects the right. So that's kind of the tiers of water rights applications we show, and going from initial to perfected, all right, top to bottom. You look at the groundwater applications, and we see that we have about 94,000 acre feet of unapproved and approved and perfected water rights. So about 4,000 unapproved, 34,500 in approved, and about 55,000 in perfected. So that's much bigger than that 26,000 acre foot volume of what we might consider safe withdrawal from the aquifer. And so this is something that we've seen in other areas throughout the state. And what we don't want to do is get too far behind the 8 ball, where we're trying to come in and implement a much more stringent groundwater management plan. And so these are some of the things that cause us alarm. I'll touch on surface appropriations really quick. There's only one unapproved surface application, and it's for 2 million acre feet. So that kind of skews these results a little bit. So you'll see that approved application about 3,000 acre feet, and perfected about 65,700 acre feet of perfected rights. So in the parentheses, I have the total without that large single application. And again, you kind of go down to the bottom right, we have about 162,000 acre feet of water rights on the records that are potentially diverted, and including surface and underground, from the Bountiful Sub-area. And so this is an opportunity for us to kind of take a look at it, do some assessment, make sure that whatever policies we have in place make sense. But you can certainly see that this data, just by the sheer volume of applications and perfected rights and how far that exceeds what we consider maybe the safe yield of the Bountiful Sub-area, gives us a little bit reason for pause. Let's talk about the governor's proclamation. On November 3rd, 2022, the governor issued a proclamation that temporarily closes the Great Salt Lake Basin to new appropriations, meaning new applications to appropriate water rights. It includes all the tributaries of the Great Salt Lake, including the Weber River, and including the small tributaries here in Davis County, and it also included groundwater. There were a few carve-outs, some exceptions to the proclamation, applications for non-consumptive use that might, non-consumptive use would be something like a hydropower, where it's not actually consuming the water, or a heat exchange pump where the water comes up, exchanges the heat, and then goes back down to the aquifer. Applications that include a mitigation plan to offset depletion. Again, we're looking for ways to prevent any more water being depleted from the system just due to the severe circumstances of the Great Salt Lake. And then there's this last carve out, applications for small amounts of water as defined under 73.3.5.6. They comply with the state engineer's policies. So applications for a small amount of water, that's a very specific provision that allows for their applications associated with 1 domestic unit, 10 head of stock, and a 1/4 acre of irrigation. As you can see, the map kind of shows the boundary of the governor's proclamation. The areas shaded in red are where current policy allows for some type of small domestic appropriation for small amounts of water, as I just kind of talked about. And so you can see Davis County and the Bountiful Sub-area are one of those areas that currently allow for that under certain requirements that I've already covered. Now, this proclamation is on top of the existing policy. So wherever there's a conflict, the governor's proclamation kind of wins, and that it adds more restrictions, not less restrictions. So here's the proposed policy. And again, we're here to receive comment. This is not going into effect. We want to understand the concerns and questions that the residents of Bountiful and Centerville have with regard to, and Woods Cross for that matter, I guess North Salt Lake. There's actually a couple of them. So residents have with regard to potential appropriation. So the proposal is that the area be closed to new consumptive appropriations of any amount, including the small amounts of water, meaning small domestics will no longer be permitted that fail to include a mitigation plan. So the area is already pretty much closed down currently. The existing policy allows for an acre-foot of water for residential purposes and stock watering where there's no public water system. So the effect of this policy change would be relatively minor as it relates to those small amounts of water that might be appropriated in areas where public water systems are unable to provide them water. So it's really not a significant shift from how the existing policy already stands here in this area, but it's still something we want to receive feedback and we want to understand better if there are concerns as it relates to that. So next step, as Teresa kind of has already laid out, we will receive and evaluate any public comment. I'll provide you I'll provide you a link, or excuse me, an address, an email address, and a physical address if you want to mail us public comment. Also, any comment you made here tonight, we will record. Refine the policy if needed, and then the adoption of policy. So what that looks like is we're going to leave tonight. We're going to ask comment and feedback, and then we'll probably schedule a meeting sometime in the summer, late summer, again, to kind of refine where we landed, right, with regard to feedback and what our analysis seems to suggest is the best way to move forward. And then at that time, we would look forward to adopting a policy, and there's a comment period that is part of that as well. So there would be an additional opportunity to comment once we have the policy that we are proposing to adopt. Right now, we just have kind of a mock proposal, right? But at that time, we would have an actual proposal that we would be considering adopting, and there would be a public comment period at that time. Here is the address where you can send your written comments to. So there's our mailing address. Just make sure, please, to add the Bountiful Sub-area as in your subject line, just so we know what policy the comment is in relation to. We are doing this in other areas of the Great Salt Lake Basin, and so we want to make sure your comment is addressed according to the right area. Or if you want to just simply email us at waterrights@utah.gov. Again, in the subject line, just put Bountiful Sub-area comment or something like that. But that's my last slide. I am happy to take any questions or comments, or hear comments. The real difficult ones I'll pass on to Teresa, but maybe I'll be able to answer them or allay any concerns you might have. Do you have anything to add, Teresa? Okay. Nailed it. All right. Well, yes, ma'am, please. Would you mind coming up to the mic for us? Thanks. Oh, doesn't look like it's on. At least 4.
So I've heard that you or someone is currently looking to reassess what we think the safe field is from the Bountiful Sub-area.
Currently, there's no anticipated groundwater study in the works. However, what we're doing is re-evaluating the existing studies we have on hand. So the last groundwater study that was done specific to this area is back in 1991. That's where that 26,000 acre feet of discharge or recharge came from. I think it's more of a, hey, assuming that's the case, why are we continuing to see groundwater declines?
Right, that's the question.
USGS and UGS. So what you may have heard, so there was some funding and there is a study on the groundwater connection to the Great Salt Lake that will include this area. So they may help refine the safe field number once they finish that study. And that's being done by the USGS and the UGS. So that might have been what you heard.
I may have sat down too soon. So we're all very concerned, and I realize the questions are in regards to the change of policy, but is there a means by which those of us who are public water suppliers within the sub-area have the ability to request or to participate in? Is it counterproductive to us? We're very concerned as we see our wells declining, and the number of the sub-basin is clearly over-appropriated. And we're all very nervous about what the future will bring. So if that's something that could appropriately be done in conjunction with the Division of Water Rights, I don't know what that process would look like, or if it is counterproductive to us to encourage water rights to start. Is this something that's best handled as a group? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that? I've just heard that study was happening, but it sounds like it's not what I thought.
Yeah, so the study that's currently underway is to understand the hydrology of the Great Salt Lake Basin, how the groundwater interacts. That's one of the kind of the mysterious pieces of the hydrology of the Great Salt Lake. But it may feed into this. But I think your statement is accurate, that the area is clearly over appropriated. There's clearly more paper water than there is physical wet water. And from review of the groundwater conditions in the wells, it's obvious that groundwater is in decline. And just based on anecdotal evidence and stories that I'm getting from some of the public water suppliers in this area, it seems that's the case. Now, we always welcome collaboration from other stakeholders, public water suppliers. And that's really what this is intended to do, is to solicit that feedback. And I'm happy to organize another meeting with public water suppliers that here. But this is kind of what this is all about, is welcoming you to provide us what feedback, as kind of the boots on the ground operators. We expect that you have a little bit more internal knowledge and understanding of what you're seeing in the aquifer. And so we really would like to see that and hear that. So we certainly welcome you to come, and if we need to make a small group meeting or have different meetings, I think we're just looking for better information that can inform the state engineer's decisions. And, I don't think there's any prescribed way of going about that. But I think this is kind of the first step in soliciting that. Thank you.
I'm Bryce Hatterley, City Manager of Woods Cross. Are you aware that in addition to the wells being drawn down, that we have areas of Woods Cross that are being affected by subsidence?
Yes, yeah, we are. I've heard word of that. I haven't really dug into the weeds as to what may be causing that. I have my own theories, but I think some of the questions I have, maybe it's not worth pontificating up here about that, but yeah, we understand that is a concern. I think that probably goes hand in hand with the groundwater decline as the effective stress on the soil pressure,
Based on
the increases.
it does. We're happy to share the information that we have through the studies, and again, just stress the importance of trying to stop this from continuing to erode, because it's just affecting more and more homes. We estimate between 50 and 200 homes have had negative impact in one degree or another from the subsidence. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, and we certainly want to be a part of that stakeholder that's trying to find solutions to kind of mitigate where we can find solutions. So thank you. Okay.
Jake Ferguson, South Davis Water. Would you mind just explaining Cedar City's situation and where we're at compared to them as far as like a groundwater revision and pulling water rights and stuff?
Yeah, so Cedar City is where we don't want to be, right? Let me provide some context. So currently, the Cedar City, there's a Cedar Valley, there's an aquifer that is exceeding the safe yield. And part of the provisions in statute allows the state engineer to implement a groundwater management plan to get an aquifer back to safe yield. And the only way to really do that is by starting to cut water rights. And the only method in which the state engineer can cut back or curtail water rights is by priority. And so you have instances, so if you have a junior water right, you would be first to cut. And the expectation is as you reduce your consumption of the aquifer eventually gets to a place where it's stable. The unfortunate thing about Cedar City is, or there's lots of unfortunate things. These are never fun, first of all, to do, but there are municipalities who have junior water rights. And so if the state engineer were to come in and say, this is how we're going to start curtailing water rights in order to get to the aquifer to stabilize, there's some pretty significant implications for the municipalities in certain cases. And so what we don't want to do is get to the point where the state engineer is kind of forced into coming here and doing a more intensive groundwater management plan where we've actually laid out the safe yield and said, all right, we've got to cut by this much. And then we formulate a list of all of the water rights, and we say, all right, in this year, we're going to cut this many. This year, we're going to cut this many. Now, these are done collaboratively, so I'm not trying to scare anyone. The state engineer tries to do these in a collaborative effort with the water users. But at the end of the day, something's got to give. And that means there's got to be less water taken from the aquifer and what's recharging it in order to get back to being stable, or it needs to be equal, right, is the goal. And that means people have to use less water. So there's never anything fun about implementing one of those groundwater management plans and curtailing right holders. But in this case, municipalities, some of the municipalities have some of the junior rights. And so it would be a pretty significant, impact to that community. And so we want to avoid that. And I'm not sure how your water rights portfolios look, but if it gets to the point where safe yield is exceeded, that might be something the state engineer has to come back and reconsider. But right now, I think we want to just evaluate, take a tactical pause, evaluate the conditions, and make sure that our policies are in line with what's best for the aquifer and for the water users. Did that answer your question, Jake, or sufficient overview? Yeah, who knows, right? I mean, obviously the aquifer appears to be in decline. We don't want to get to that point. So I think this is kind of an escalation of force. The first is, hey, let's pause. Let's make sure we're doing the right things and understand the situation a little bit better. Certainly, I don't think we're seeing the declines that we've seen in some of these areas where we've implemented these types of groundwater management plans, but that doesn't mean that it's, that we wouldn't do it here, or that it may not be necessary here. That's it.
I'm Greg Sigmiller, JV engineer with Woods Cross City as well. One of the concerns that we have, or that I have in evaluating the groundwater for the Woods Cross area is that of some of the legislation that's come out that's prohibiting any reuse after November 1st of this year. The idea, of course, is to take that effluent from treatment plants and such, put it out in the lake. The idea, the concern is that now will push the curtain between salt water underneath the lake and fresh water coming from the mountains, push that further and further to the east, because now you're filling the bowl out there, and you've got water out here in the bowl. You're pushing water to that. It fills the groundwater table and pushes the salt further and further away, closer and closer to culinary drinking water wells. Is there anything that can be done to stop that in an area such as this Bountiful Sub-area, so that secondary water could be utilized, or excuse me, effluent water could be utilized for industry, refineries, secondary, so that water is still available for its maximum depletion?
Yeah, so as you mentioned yourself, November 1st is when that kind of it turns into a pumpkin, right? No more reuse allowed after that. I have engaged in pre-filing consultation with municipalities who are filing an application based just to have one in place, so they have a reuse application in place prior to November 1st. So if you're looking for ways to address that, and that's one way. I'm not sure if that's that you're telling me to stop. I'm not sure I am qualified to speak with regard to the saltwater curtain, but there are obviously ways that you can file a reuse permit prior to November 1st, and we would be more than happy to kind of walk you through the pre-filing consultation on that and what that looks like. I'm not sure if that answers your question or if you had follow-on question. Teresa, did you have anything to add on that? Okay. She looked like she was antsy. I was getting nervous. I was saying something wrong.
Jerry Wilson, Bountiful Water. I do have a follow-up question about that. So from what I understand about the reuse thing is, if you've already got a reuse program in place, that's not going to be prohibited. It's just new reuse. Is that correct?
Yeah, let's be very clear, because I think words have meanings in this case, and I want to be abundantly clear. If you have an existing reuse application / permit with the state engineer's office, so you said reuse program, I want to make sure that it's not something that's being operated independently. So there are two kind of regulatory agencies that issue reuse permits. You got the Division of Water Rights and the Division of Water Quality, and have them both in place. And I'm not sure. Come talk to me later, and I'll look at my spreadsheet and just make sure if you believe you guys have a reuse. Oh. Yeah. And that's what I was saying. If you file it and file it prior to November 1st, then you're kind of grandfathered in. So if there's already existing reuse permits that have been issued, those would be, they won't be terminated, only on whatever conditions they were issued under, right? Yeah, good question. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I guess it's more of a clarification or something, but the existing groundwater plan was last updated in 1991, right? Is that
95?
95. So that's about 27 years or so, 28 years. Why hasn't it been updated since then? And will it be updated ever, or is it going to be kind of these ad hoc things just building on top of it?
That's a great question. It's probably something, it's just a resource constraint from our office, right? Is these groundwater management plans. So this was done under the old statute. New statutes are a little bit more labor intensive. I don't think there's any reason why it wouldn't be updated. I think the requirement would be, hey, maybe part of this process is taking a look at the data and saying, hey, do we need to update it? That may be one of the outcomes of this public policy process. But again, we have limited resources. It's a big state. Doesn't mean this doesn't warrant it, but I think we are looking at it. We've heard a lot of feedback from public water suppliers with regard to their groundwater wells, and so it's kind of we put the resources where we think the need is, and so we feel like this is something that has sufficient need. At the same time, there's not much you can do to further restrict what's already going on here from a water rights perspective. It's already closed to appropriations with the exception of those small domestic applications. And so any policy update. Now, there may be more data until we want to, but if we want to go to a full-on groundwater management plan, then we kind of go from 0 to 60 pretty quick in what that entails. So I think we would just have to understand whether the juice is worth the squeeze on reevaluating the groundwater management plan to make sure it's meaningful and that it's helpful and it will, ultimately help the water users of the area. So I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm just saying this probably may be the first step in trying to understand whether that's a good thing to pursue or not, or whether it's effort that could be placed elsewhere.
Follow up on that, and I'll admit I don't know what I'm talking about.
You're right. You're right.
Degree, but it seems to me that if we'd have constantly updated that water management plan, would that avoided where we're at now with the gap that we have?
There's a potential. Yeah, I think when the plan was issued, I was looking at the plan a little bit earlier, and they said at the time it was already over appropriated. I think there was 50,000 acre feet of water rights at the time that it was issued in 1995. I'm struggling to reconcile how we got from 55,000 acre feet to 90,000 acre feet by small domestic applications. So I'm a little suspicious of either our present data or the past data. But to answer your question, yeah, obviously there may have been a disconnect between 1995 and where we are today. And I think you got to kind of look at it holistically. What's gone on in this area over the last 30 years? One of the things that's happened is a lot of the irrigable land has gone away. The large-scale irrigation that was being brought in from the Weaver River is no longer infiltrating into the groundwater. I think I was looking at the report, and they said about 3,700 acre feet of that recharge came from irrigation. And so that's a pretty big chunk. And so as places become more urbanized and they engage less in flood irrigation practices, that changes the landscape of the groundwater system. Now, whether that's the factor or a factor or not a factor is something that is probably worth looking at a little bit more. But I think as places urbanize, that's just one of the natural consequences. And, it's happening in a lot of places, not just Bountiful and Centerville, North Salt Lake, and Woods Cross. Any other questions? Hand it off to you for final words if you have any.
And maybe I'll just kind of summarize. So we do a lot of public meetings across the state where we look at the condition of the resource and what the policies say. If I were to kind of to put forward what I see maybe happening for this basin, number one, I really do think the best step forward is to close the basin to new appropriations completely. But that's not always the easiest to do. And so these public meetings help us make sure that we're connecting with the communities that are in the area. And that's exactly the comments you guys gave us tonight. And if there's any follow-up comments that help us understand that. We don't want to just make those decisions in a black box and then roll out that we change the policy. So if I were to guess, the next steps would be that we'll be back with a policy saying the most appropriate is to close the basin to new appropriations. But then we start looking at all these applications that are unapproved. What do we do with them? Do we have sufficient information that we would need to reject them or approve them? What do we need to do just so that we can get a baseline of what is the impact or the demand based on the water rights for this area? But also part of that is to work with the local communities, the local water companies, and try and help understand what is a good way to manage the existing water rights. If it does become a groundwater management area, they aren't pretty, and they're very difficult to implement and for folks to accept. And so if there's ways as we approach that to work with the communities, we're happy to do that and lend our expertise as to what we've seen in other valleys, some solutions that other valleys have implemented to try to bring the groundwater basin into safe yield, such as recharge. A little bit different for this area, but we're committed to working with the communities in what does that next step look like. And, you know, as far as why haven't we come, it's been 27 years. To be honest, we just didn't have that many applications. And really what prompted this, I would say, is the governor's proclamation closing the entire Great Salt Lake Basin, where we now have to step through each area and say, okay, what do we have? What do we need to do with these policies? This one seems a little, if I were to guess, pretty straightforward as to what needs to happen in this area. But we want to make sure that we're getting that full public comment. And, you know, please give it to us, even if you didn't give it to us tonight, and you want to send it to us in the email or write us that comment. We're happy to receive it. So with that, I think Blake did a great job in presenting the data. I want to know where that 2 million acre foot surface water right, Lake Bonham, wherever that was going to be. But we don't know. Anyway, and it wasn't Lake Bonneville, it was Bonham. But we truly appreciate you coming out to talk with us and give us the information and make the connections. So if you do have additional questions, we'll be here for just a little bit if you want to approach us individually. But thank you for coming out.